Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's session of the Berkeley Forum. My name is Aparna Iyer. I'm the president of the forum, and we are so excited for tonight's event, the last one of the semester and of this academic year, a panel on the future of cities. Before we begin, a few quick reminders for our audience. Please fill out the attendance form at tinyurl.com/citiesforum so we know you are here, and submit questions for our moderator to read aloud at tinyurl.com/citiesquestions. Okay. And with that, I'd like to invite up our moderator for the evening, Abhay Agarwal, to introduce each of the speakers for tonight.
Thank you so much, Aparna. So to begin, the format of the event will be as follows. I will introduce each of our speakers one by one, and they will present a brief 3-minute overview of their position and thoughts on our panel's topic tonight. So our first speaker of the night is Dr. Clara Irazabel Zurita. So Clara Irazabel Zurita, a doubly proud Berkeley alumni, is director and professor of the Urban Studies and Planning program and affiliate of the National Center for Smart Growth at the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, University of Maryland College Park in the Washington, D.C. area. In her research and teaching, she explores the interactions of culture, politics, and placemaking and their impact on community development and socio-spatial justice in Latin American cities and US Latinx, immigrant, and minority communities. Please welcome Dr. Clara Irazabel.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you tonight. Thank you for the invite. Let me share my screen, please. Do you see my full screen? Do you see my full screen? Do you hear me?
Yes, looks good. Thank you.
Okay, very well. So what I want to share with you is just 3 basic ideas for this opening part of the presentation on the future of cities. First is that we need to reclaim our imagination in order to think of different cities of the ones that we have today. We first need to imagine them, right? So how would the sustainable city look like? How would the just city look like? And those, I would propose, should be the benchmark for our imagination and our pursuit of future cities. Because if we can imagine them, then we can progress toward those goals. We can know how we can get there. But we need to respond to this quadripartite crisis that we have in the world today. Evidently, the pandemic, or a public health crisis in larger terms, the racial classes crisis, but it's also a social crisis in larger terms, because I want to also include the aspect of class in there. The climate crisis, and some people say the pandemic is derived from it because it has created havoc in the fauna. And then the economic crisis and how that is transforming the world, but certainly not for the better. It seems as if it is a monster of many different heads and faces that we need to combat. And what we need to do to combat it is actually to challenge the current developmental paradigm and how it operates in our cities. We tend to believe that sustainable development is that creates an equilibrium between these 3 different E's portrayed here: the economy, equity for people, and the environment. And the more balance you have between the 3, the more sustainable supposedly the development is. But the fact of the matter is that in reality, we have economic driving all of our efforts and driving progress and development all together, to the point that it's squeezing out equity and environment for the equation. That prominence of the economy, we have to flip around altogether to put into more prominence the 2 E's of equity and environment. And it's not to say that economy is not important, it is, but we need to think about it in terms of means to help us to get to the ends that we're interested in. That is the instrument that can help us to get to cities that are more equitable and more sustainable altogether. And what are the things that we need to do right away? We have to rebalance these 3 E's and put the economy as an instrument to bring about the just and the sustainable city. We have to live within the system's biocapacities, that of cities and regions and countries and the planet Earth. We have to do a lot more for climate change adaptation and mitigation and resilience. And unfortunately, that prompts us to be better equipped to respond to disasters that we are already facing in cities and that are to come. We need to be prepared for that and for reconstruction after that in manners that take into consideration issues of justice, racial justice, social justice, climate justice, environmental justice, and intergenerational and interspecies justice. Is not about solely the human race. It is about the whole ecosystems that we're part of, right? So how do we get there? What would be the formulas or the recipes that we can follow? We certainly have some grounding from which we can start up. Is it the Green New Deal? Is it the Biden plan? They certainly have great ideas and we can elaborate and expand on that, but certainly it would all depend on the first message that I had for you tonight, which is that of reclaiming our imagination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Razabel, for your address. And our next speaker for the evening is Dr. Janil Puthucheary. So Dr. Janil Puthucheary is a member of the government of Singapore. He currently serves as the Senior Minister of State in the Ministry of Communications and Information and the Ministry of Health. Prior to this, he was the Senior Minister of State in the Ministry of Transport. Dr. Puthucheary has led public initiatives to integrate smart city technologies, improve public transportation accessibility, and strengthen Singapore's multiracial cohesion. As Minister in charge of GovTech, he is actively involved in implementing Singapore's Smart Nation digital transformation. I would now like to welcome Dr. Puthucheary up to our virtual stage.
Thank you, Abe. Can I check that I can be heard and seen? Thank you, Abe and Arpana, and to the friends from Berkeley for inviting me to join you today from Singapore. It's in the morning, it's 12 hours time difference. I'm going to talk at the very practical level what has happened in Singapore, what our aspirations are for the future. In the 56 short years since we've been independent, we've been focused on a integrated vision of what our city and our country should be. We are a city in a state and a state in a city. And it must be livable because we are so closely packed to each other. It must be sustainable because our resources within the city boundaries are limited, and it has to be inclusive. We are one people living cheek by jowl with each other. And we have achieved what we have done so far through an active process of transformation using technology and learning from the best models in the world. And I think those are two ideas that we have to continue to hold on to going forward. I think the interesting part of our discussion will be later. So I'm just going to give you a few facts and ideas to, in a way, give you a sense of what Singapore is like if you haven't visited. We have 5.7 million people living in 720 square kilometers. That's less than 1/5 the size of the state of California. 14% of our land is dedicated to housing, but 12%, worryingly, is dedicated to roads. We need to get around. 80% of our people live in public housing. Now, of course, our public housing is of a different nature from what is meant by public housing in many parts of the world. You take a loan, you build your own home, and you have an increase in value over time, but is nevertheless publicly managed by the state as part of that process of urban transformation. We've had to impose 0% vehicle growth rate. You can't increase the number of cars in Singapore. There just aren't enough roads and space. And so cars become a luxury item that have to be dealt with in a very particular economic model. As a result of which, we have a fairly high public transport peak modal share. About 68% of peak modal share is public transport and improving every day. Nevertheless, because of that series of constraints, we have to be extremely connected to the rest of the world. Our airport pre-pandemic, we had about 1,000 planes a day passing through. There are about 1,000 ships in our port at any one time. And our land crossing with Malaysia, our nearest neighbor, is one of the busiest in the world, with about 300,000 people and 145 vehicles going back and forth every day in a tidal manner. And yet we have held on to the ideal of wanting to be a clean and green and beautiful, livable city. It's a work in progress, but we think we're making some headroom in terms of increasing the greenery, the green cover of our city, requiring buildings to meet higher and higher standards and have increasing amounts of green cover as part of that urban redevelopment. And one example, we have 6 million trees in Singapore. We have more trees than we have people. It's something that I think we are justly proud of, 3 million of which are part of our urban environment, and the other 3 million are in our forest reserves. And at the same time, we've had to actively transform, as Dr. Irazabal talked about, the role of the economic factors, using technology to optimize efficiency, reduce pollution, reduce resource consumption. One example was the transformation of our energy sector almost completely to LNG many years ago to reduce both the pollution and carbon take. But other examples include waste recovery and incineration. We incinerate almost all our waste, reducing then the need for landfill and allowing us to recover energy from that process. Water is another good example where we've had to actively transform our city, where we started off as one of the most water-stressed nations in the world. And today, more than 2/3 of our land area is water catchment. And we end up recycling a lot of our water. So as we go forward into the future of our city, wanting to learn from the best in the world, some of those considerations that have been here with us for the last 56 years are not going to change. We have to have a zero-sum mentality here in Singapore around some key factors: land, energy, carbon, pollution, manpower, water. We will need to manage our city on a process of active transformation. And to do so, we will need to be data-driven, opening up much of that data for citizen involvement, co-creation of platforms, products, and services. And we'll have to be tech-focused so that we can use the best opportunities around science and technology to achieve those types of outcomes for our people. And ultimately, we have to be values-driven. We are close together, whether we like it or not, despite the fact that we are one of the most religiously, ethnically, and culturally diverse cities in the world. We have to behave and be one people. And our approach around urban transformation, the use of data, the use of technology, has to hold those types of values front and center so that we become the sort of city-state that we aspire to be. Thank you very much, and I look forward to all your questions. Back to you, Abe.
Thank you so much, Dr. Puthucheary, for your address. Our final speaker for the evening is Commissioner Mitchell Silver. Mitchell Silver became Commissioner of the New York City Department of Parks in May 2014. Commissioner Silver is president of the American Institute of Certified Planners and past president of the American Planning Association. He's internationally recognized for his leadership in the planning profession and his contributions to contemporary planning issues. One of the nation's most celebrated urban thinkers, Commissioner Silver has been elected to Planetizen's list of the 100 most influential urbanists in the world and named an honorary member of the American Society of Landscape Architects. In addition, he has been honored as one of the top 100 city innovators in the world by UBM Future Cities. And in 2012, the Urban Times named him one of the top international thought leaders of the built environment. I would now like to welcome Commissioner Silver to the virtual stage.
Thank you, Abe. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. I first want to share that I agree with my fellow panelists. And one, I just have to emphasize that as we look at today and as we look at tomorrow, we're really going through this age of disruption, whether it's economic, political, civil and social unrest, and a pandemic. We are going through an age of disruption, but at a disruption, at that tension, I believe something's going to be quite fruitful. I'm a parks commissioner, so I look at our parks as a way of helping us navigate a way forward. What do I mean by that? Number one, we're looking at our parks as a way of healing our planet. Parks are not just these green spaces. Our parks are really for physical health, but also for mental health as well. Number two, It helps take care of our planet. Our urban canopy that absorbs carbon dioxide and gives us oxygen. It collects stormwater. Our parks are serving multiple purposes than just being these green spaces. So I'm looking to parks for a couple of reasons. One, it could help heal our planet, but it could also heal our people. We're watching through this global pandemic, our people going through generational trauma, whether it's what they're seeing from Black Lives Matter or what they're going through as a result through Black Lives Matter or what they're going to result of the pandemic. People need places to heal. And I believe as we look to the future, we have to reposition our parks to be looked at as part of our healthcare system. One, to heal us, to bring us joy, because we all recognize through COVID that parks were the sanctuaries of sanity where people went to feel alive. And that's why I'm very proud that we're repositioning how we look at our parks to make sure that they provide that to really address some of the public health inequities that we've been dealing with. Because here in the US, we've noticed that some of the hardest hit neighborhoods are Black and brown communities as it relates to COVID. So we have been very focused on providing those open space opportunities. We've been very focused on providing those places where people can heal. And we have a number of programs here in New York City to make sure we provide those open spaces for people. Number two, in terms of climate change, we're looking very carefully at our park system as the first line of defense. We're looking at how we can address some of those issues using new techniques and looking at parks as essential infrastructure and not just these green, nice amenities. We're seeing major transformation in our cities, and we're focusing on 4 key things that I believe will help us have a more prosperous future: diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. When we talk about those 4 terms, I'll define them for you. We have to look at them very differently if we're going to grow together as a nation and grow together as a planet. Diversity means the value of different perspectives. Equity means fairness. Inclusion means being welcoming to all and not being exclusive. And then finally, access, removing barriers. If we truly want to have a city of the future and just cities, we have to look at diversity, equity, inclusion, and access. The other point about those 4 terms, this is not something we do. It's who we are. As we embrace these values, we'll be able to plan very differently for the future of our cities, and it will help address this disruption that I described when I started my conversation. So as I close, I want us to look at parks very differently than we had in the past, as a way of dealing with climate change, that they can heal the planet, but also as a place for respite, relaxation. We could also heal our people, because we are going through some major, major trauma. And these are the spaces and places that can help heal us. And I'm optimistic we will figure it out. So I'm very excited about having this conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Abhay.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Silver, for your address. And thank you all for your addresses. We will now be moving into the moderating portion of the event, where I will be asking questions to all of our speakers. They will alternate as they provide their answers. And before I begin, I would like to invite the audience to please fill out the audience Q&A form as they have any questions throughout the event. So to start off, I want to touch on a subject regarding social issues and inequities that all 3 of you touched on within the course of your addresses. So some have argued that existing social issues, such as racial inequities, as well as healthcare inequality, are often neglected in city planning. So how, if at all, can city and state governments ensure a balanced and equitable urban development process when it comes to our urban spaces, as well as public projects and initiatives? And I'd like to direct this question initially to Commissioner Silver.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Number one, these are new issues for a lot of people to deal with. And I think as we start to have a conversation, equity, fairness has to be a measure in which we start to address the services we provide. I'll give you an example. Let's take our park system here in New York City. We looked at how much we invested over 20 years in our parks. It turned out it was $6 billion. But during that time frame, there were some communities that got literally no investments in their parks. That's not fair. And so we changed it and made sure that those communities got their fair share, and we started to address those parks first. It wasn't fair that these parks were hiding in plain sight, and we used a data-driven approach to find out exactly where we were doing it wrong. So it is focusing on data-driven techniques, doing the analysis to find out if we have capital dollars for our cities, is it being distributed fairly? We also hear this term underserved communities. That means some communities are overserved. We have to stop using the term underserved and make sure we give them their just needs so that they can have a thriving community where families, people can grow and prosper. So we have to really focus on true equity. And as I said, it's not something you do. It has to be a value you embrace. Once you do that, you'll be able to really achieve great things. I apologize, there's a protest going outside as I speak that's somewhat distracting me. I live in New York, we literally have protests almost every single night. So I'm gonna put my mute on so you don't hear it.
All good, Commissioner Silver. Do any other panelists have thoughts on this question?
Thanks, Abe. Maybe I could just make a couple of comments from the Singapore perspective. We have the benefit of being a new city, relatively speaking, 56 years old. And so we've been able to actively plan some of our urban development. And one of the early decisions that we made was that each township, each neighborhood should be broadly representative of our nation as a whole in terms of cultural backgrounds, as well as socioeconomic dispersion, the size of homes, for example. And so in each neighborhood, in each township, you have a little microcosm of our country at large. That's required a certain intrusive social planning and forward planning. But going upstream has allowed us then to have some downstream benefits in terms of the distribution of infrastructure and urban resources. And these were decisions, I mean, as a politician, you want to claim credit for everything, but these were decisions made 3 generations ago that we are now seeing the benefits of. But having said that, it doesn't solve every problem. And I very much agree with Commissioner that even in places where you've had the opportunity for that type of upstream planning, we need the downstream data collection process to then drive active interventions to then relieve inequities that will continue to result as a result of human activity. Thanks.
I would like to argue that also in order to reframe the way that we design and plan our cities, I think that we have to give more prominence to make our efforts more human-centered. That is, to value humans more than we value things, more than we value buildings, commodities, houses, infrastructure, hard infrastructure in the city, and the financialization of all of these things, right? We have to value humans, put humans at the center of development, but not only humans. I would also argue that we have to value other beings. We have to value nature in general terms and other species in particular. We have to reinvite nature into our cities. Parks are a great example, an instrument to do that. And lastly, I would argue that we also have to have a focus that is intergenerational, because this equity business that we're all referring to is not only among the people and the species that are currently alive, but also the ones that are to come 5 generations down the road, as some of our indigenous communities have taught us.
Thank you so much. And going off that topic of the impact that planning has on communities and inequities related to it, some critics have expressed the idea that poor urban planning has a history of negatively impacting specifically people of color. For instance, speaking in the American context, according to the American Lung Association, people of color are more likely to live in counties with higher levels of pollution. So what role, if any, does social justice-centered design have in urban planning in general? And I would like to direct this question specifically to Dr. Irazabel, but the rest of the panelists, please feel free to chime in as well.
It is true that unfortunately, urban planning has a history that it doesn't need to feel proud about, because it has contributed with other institutions to create the legacy that we're suffering today in terms of racial and social discrimination in our cities. For example, take the issue of redlining. Legally sanctioned separation between different parts of our cities in which people of color Black and other people of color weren't allowed to buy housing or to improve the properties that they owned there, just out of discrimination, so that other part of the city could be kept white. And this is something that was outlawed in paper in the late 60s, but which legacy we are still suffering today. And we still have those communities segregated and suffering the conditions that you referred to in terms of pollutions of different kinds, and the greatest negative effect of climate change. It turns out that the communities that were redlined in the past continue to be majority minority communities in the present, and the ones that are, for example, suffering the greatest extreme heat that have come about with climate change in US cities. So we need to address this matter, we need to recognize it, and we need to think about reform and restitution in a number of ways that we can go about it. And certainly through the infrastructure that Dr. Sherry and Silver have referred to, particularly parks.
Yeah, and I wanted to add that this may be a surprise to a lot of the students. I've heard in the introduction, some are in planning, some are in different programs. But what shocked me is that when I went to planning school, the books like The Color of Law did not exist. I was not aware when I went to planning school in the 80s and then in the 90s for grad school, that racism was baked in to the American system. It was baked in, from redlining to covenants to single family zoning to school policy. It's baked into the American system to the point that you can't recognize it. And a lot of whites just assumed that these neighborhoods were bad all by themselves, that these people of color, they created these low-income areas that are underserved, under-resourced. And now today, because we have books like The Color of Law and a lot more students are reading it, they're finding out about it now. The planning profession was very, very white. In fact, it's still less than 10% people of color. But there's now a new discovery that we do have to do something about it, whether it's reparations and some cities are actually going down the road of providing reparations for some families to apologize about what is happening. But I do believe cities need to go to the over-resourced communities and start giving it to the under-resourced communities as a way of addressing that reparations. So I'm very pleased as I talk to my colleagues who are professors, The Color of Law is now becoming required reading. So as students are coming out of school, they understand how exclusionary and how racist single family zoning, a lot of our policies, and even if you look at the New Deal from Roosevelt, it was all racism was baked right into that system. And so I'm looking at FDR very differently today than I had when I was growing up. So I think there is an opportunity through reparations and recognizing what has happened so we can find a better path forward. And I have to tell you, when I read The Color of Law, it's like saying, I went to planning school, why weren't we taught this? Why weren't we taught this? And so I'm very, very delighted that the younger generation can now start their profession understanding exactly what we have to do to correct past wrongs.
All right. And so moving into a topic which Dr. Arazabel touched on in her answer to the previous question, climate change is expected to impact communities of color as well as impoverished communities around the globe fairly negatively in terms of scale and impact to an extent that we have not seen yet. And so what steps, if any, should cities worldwide be taking to build in resilience to protect communities, especially marginalized communities, from the impacts of climate change? And I would like to direct this question initially to Dr. Puthucheary.
Thanks, Abe. Climate change is very much the top of our mind. We're an island state, and so we will be at great risk if when the ocean levels rise. But we're also extremely dependent on the rest of the world for the importation of food and water and various other supply chains. So we feel that vulnerability, and we have taken a number of steps. Before we talk about the steps for mitigation, we also have to play our part. I mean, you have to demonstrate your social and moral commitment to this, and some of the things that I've talked about: waste, LNG, water recovery. This was part of dealing with vulnerability and improving our resilience, but also it's the right thing to do, and that gives you a certain moral compass, I suppose, as you think through the mitigation steps and the risk adaptation steps. But for us, simple things, well, not simple things, they're very expensive things, such as raising the datum of our coastline. We have done so, raising the minimum height required for new projects, building up coastal protection zones. These are all fundamental things that will take a lot of time and money, but we've started increasing the height of roads even to reduce the impact of flooding. But when it comes to the dispersion of effects, marginalized communities versus privileged communities, for us, in a way, we are the beneficiary of several decades of a particular type of urban planning where there isn't a physical space where you can say these are where the marginalized or the underprivileged, because as I say, every town, every neighborhood, you have a certain mix of house sizes, family sizes, wealth distribution, cultural distribution. That has allowed us then to make climate change adaptation mitigation truly a national effort for everyone. And that social buy-in, that these types of efforts, which will cause some disruption, will be for the benefit of everybody equitably, I think is an important byproduct of that integration of some long-term planning, as well as the very current risks of climate change. The issues that Dr. Razabal and Commissioner Silva brought up in the previous question, I completely agree that those types of inequity and unequal distribution can indeed be brought about either deliberately or unintentionally by planning. But having addressed it either at the planning stage or subsequently through a reparation intervention, one of the things that we are very cognizant of is that human behavior after the fact can return you back to that type of inequitable distribution. And we see some of that in our private homes, private estates. Some of the mechanisms that I talk about are only applicable within the 80% of our population that live in public funded or public supported housing estates. And in the 20% that live in purely private housing estates, the behavior of the market demonstrates a little bit of that assortment of inequitability that the other two speakers have talked about. And that's something that we are very aware of. And I think it demonstrates the fact that even with best planning and interventions upstream, downstream aggregate human behavior can lead to race-based, social status-based inequality redistributing itself. And we've seen this in a number of cities around the world. And it's something that we have to pay a lot of attention to. Thanks, Abe.
I would like to remind us that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its latest report said that we had till 2030 to have the levels of emissions that we have in the world, or else that we were going to be suffering even greater negative consequences of climate change, the ones that we are already seeing. So this is to suggest that the future is now. We're 9 years from 2030. That's nothing in historical terms. So we really need to act now and act very dramatically. And that would need transformation at all scales. It demands personal transformation, but it also evidently demands transformation at the city, metropolitan, state, country, and even global levels, right? And very glad to see cities such as in Singapore, being at the forefront of this transformation, leading the transformation that we need to see in the rest of the world. Cities can be, and some are part of the solution and part of the trend and the leadership that we need to follow. I would also like to suggest that there is a historical depth that the greatest emitters of the world, including and particularly the United States, owe to the rest of the world, and most particularly countries that have less opportunities and resources to deal with that. And as you suggested in the posing of the question, are the ones that are taking the gravest of the effect of the climate change.
Yeah, I just want to add that I read a book by Thomas Friedman, and he says something very powerful in that book about the greatest generation. He said the reason why they were the greatest is that they gave their today for our tomorrow. And what concerns me when I look at climate change is that those who are climate deniers are giving away your tomorrow for our today. And that's wrong. If there's nothing I'm more concerned about for my children and my grandchildren, that we are losing time each and every day. But I'm optimistic, as Dr. Arrazabal and Puducherry said, that people are taking action at the local level. Municipalities are taking action at the local level. And while we sort this out on the global scale, we are seeing those interventions. New York City believes in climate change. The mayor signed on to the Climate Accord, spending $20 billion to address climate change here in New York City because we believe it's real. We had a major storm that killed close to 40 people and property, and we're rebuilding our city and fortifying it using our parks, as I stated, as the first line of defense. But I'm optimistic because all of you listening, the younger generation think very differently. And it is my goal, as long as I'm living, that we want to go back to the greatest generation and give our today for your tomorrow, because this planet needs us to do that. So that's all I'm going to share, but there's a lot of things going on at the local level that I'm very proud of. Cities are starting to reposition themselves. We are seeing change in terms of just a few years ago when they laughed about having hybrid vehicles and electric cars. You're seeing them rolling out more and more. So change is happening slowly. I'm sure all the oil and gas companies are getting nervous because they too see the future. And so I'm going to remain optimistic because of all of you listening. And I am gratified that you're going to make sure that we finally get to address the issues of climate change and make sure we reverse these patterns and start to heal our planet.
Speaking about less forward-thinking infrastructure as well as designs in our cities, many cities were and continue to be designed to be centered on cars. So how, if at all, can cities worldwide be made more walkable, more resilient, and more healthy, in spite of this infrastructure being in place in many places around the globe? And I would like to start by directing this question to Dr. Arrazabal.
Well, I think that we can take the lead from Singapore to start with. Perhaps we all planners should pay our tribute and tour the city and learn from it, and others, a few others like it in the world that have given prominence to pedestrian accessibility and to have put a stop to the growth of car ridership and car ownership in the cities. We have to be radical about that. And now we have the resources to do that without compromising accessibility and mobility. The whole transportation paradigm needs to change, even the wording of it. We don't have to call it transportation any longer, because that assumes that you have to displace yourself from point A to point B to go about your business. But if you have mixed use cities, then you can walk to places without necessarily having to ride a motored vehicle, right? And particularly a fossil fueled vehicle. That's what we want to avoid. And now we have, as Mitchell was referring to, we have electric cars, and we have cars that can drive themselves, and the technology is helping us to do that and expand that technology in manners that can reach more people. So we have the tools, we have the science, the technology. We mostly need the political will to make this transformation possible, because I think that even the people are already on board to see this happen.
I have to say to Dr. Puducherry that Singapore is still the most intelligent, innovative city-state on the planet. Every time I go there, I'm so impressed how forward-thinking they are. And we actually use, I know Dr. Chiang, she used to be with the housing ministry. I don't know where she is now, but every time I go, I walk away just filled with more and more knowledge about how innovative Singapore is. Having said that, to get your question, you're absolutely right. Our streets are the most untapped resource we have, and I do believe it's going to be the conversation of the future. Every city is talking about it during COVID. Since we had to use our streets for multiple purposes, we're now realizing that we have to take it back for people. And there are leaders around the world that are doing that. Barcelona, Paris, even here in New York, We're now looking at that asset. It's the public realm. It's for the public. We paid our tax dollars to create it, and we gave far too much of that for cars to park or to drive. We want to take it back. In New York City, 14% of our city is parks. 26% consists of streets and sidewalks. That's 40% of New York City is in the public realm. Yet that 26%, we can't touch it. It's delegated for cars. And so I have to look at the Singapore model of what we need to do here, but we have to reclaim that public space, less for cars, more for people. That is starting, as I said again, look at what they're doing in Barcelona, taking 16 intersections and recreating them. Paris, they're changing how they're approaching when and where people could use their vehicles. And now in New York City, we closed off Times Square. We call it the intersection of the world to cars and gave it back to people. So I do believe this is the greatest opportunity going forward as our city becomes more dense. You cannot have a livable city unless you have open space and places for people. So I do believe post-COVID, this is one of the great opportunities that all cities are going to start to look at. How do they reclaim their public realm for the public and not for cars?
Thank you very much for your kind words about Singapore. As you know, I'm the beneficiary of my predecessors that I get to live in this city. So, but we welcome you to come and visit again, and we're looking forward to the day when that visit is easier than under the current restrictions. But you know, we continue to think through some of the challenges, and they are quite challenging in this realm of the shift, that dynamic process where the car becomes the norm from a luxury, it becomes the norm, and then you need to shift back down towards walking and public transportation. And what that has required is really us having to think through our models of ownership and regulation of the public transport structures, the road space structures, as well as increasingly for us an opportunity presented through the point-to-point transport, where that can fill the gap between private car ownership and true public transport. We've benefited from the pressure that has resulted from zero vehicle growth rate, such that the desire for car ownership then has been dropping with a decreasing proportion of households having access to a car year on year for the last few years, then making that sort of walkable public transport based city that we envision 2030, 2040 much more possible. But what it has required is really an ownership of that whole space from the edge of your property all the way to the median divider, and having a sense that we can sacrifice some of the pavement for cycling paths to begin with, and then later on reclaim some of the road lane to put back some pavement, and have that dynamic process over time, so that space between the edge of your property and the median road divider plays an appropriate role in our transport mix. And on the regulatory side, making sure that public transport is both very affordable, but also the rollout and deployment of public transport nodes continues to serve areas where people are living and moving to, including where we've relocated work to be closer to home, requires a certain ownership and regulatory model, which again, we've had to adapt over time so that we can drive those types of forward investments in public transport to enable this social transformation, which is the result that we want. But thank you for your kind words. As I say, I hope we get a chance to meet in person one day in Singapore. Come and visit us.
As we talk about the importance of public spaces, public infrastructure, and public transportation, it is important to note that often in the past, disabled communities, communities of color, and other impoverished communities have not been part of the conversation and have not had spaces that were built specifically for them, with a great example being Robert Moses's policies in New York City in the post-war era. And so what I wanted to ask about is how, if at all, should cities incorporate and uplift these communities and their voices when looking at how we should transform our public spaces and public infrastructure into the rest of the 21st century. And I would like to direct this to Commissioner Silver initially.
Well, I started the conversation, my opening, and I absolutely agree with you. Really, that's about inclusive, welcoming to all. I'm very proud to say on any project that we're engaged in, We go beyond what we're required to make sure the places are accessible. We're removing fences. We're making our parks more accessible. We're removing stairs, and so that whether you have a stroller, a wheelchair, a cane, or have issues with walking, we want to make sure that you have easy access. In terms of communities, we don't just want to have a public transport system, but some of the bus stops, we want it to be a dignified mode of transportation. You go to many parts of this country and you see people standing by the road in the heat or in the rain without any shelter. We do have to have these conversations and understand through public engagement what people need rather than doing top-down planning. But having a place that's welcoming for all, having a transit system that feels welcoming to everyone, that does need to have a conversation we need to have. And so I absolutely agree with you. Inclusive means welcoming all. Access means removing the barriers to enjoy that public benefit, and that's something we should all be committed to doing. So I absolutely agree with your question, and we have to do a better job of reaching out to those that are disadvantaged by access to the services they need to just live their daily lives.
I would argue that it is important to look at public spaces and parks in particular, not only as products, as elements, entities that are out there for the public to enjoy, but also as processes, right? And we need to involve people, particularly the ones that have been historically marginalized from these products and processes, to all levels and stages of development and maintenance of these public spaces. That is the co-production, the co-design, the co-planning of these spaces to start with, the construction of them, the maintenance, repair, and management of them, and certainly the programming of them. We also tend to think about public spaces too often as these physical elements or spatial elements that are out there, but it turns out that they can be rich in programming. And depending on the type of programming that you have in public space, then you would have inclusivity of people of color, of low-income communities, of the disenfranchised and the handicapped in many other ways. So it is important to understand public spaces as this complicated bundle of processes, products, management issues, and programming.
Dr. Putticherry, I don't know if you want to say this. I wanted to add two specific examples to show why accessibility, inclusiveness is not just physical, as Dr. Rezabel just said, but it's about rules. Two examples. In our parks in 2017, there was a rule in our parks that said you could not loiter. Now, in a park, loitering means to stand or wait idly by with no apparent purpose. Newsflash, that is what you do in a park. But that rule can be weaponized. If you're a nice white couple sitting on a bench, how lovely, they look cute and adorable. But if there are 5 black or brown teenagers, all of a sudden, law enforcement come in and say, you need to move along. Luckily, in 2017, New York City removed loitering as a rule in our parks. So we actually launched an art project called the Yes Loitering Project to encourage teenagers to enjoy public space and to find out where they feel excluded. That's what inclusion means. So that's one example. That one broke my heart. We removed all the signs. You can now loiter. We want you to loiter, sit in our parks and do nothing and just look at the trees. That's what we want you to do. The other example, I heard there was concern about the homeless because we have signs in our parks that adults cannot go into certain parks, playgrounds, unless they're accompanied by an adult. Now, in that park, there's a comfort station, there are benches, and there are trees. But if you're over the age of 12, you cannot go into that public space. Now, I was told because they were trying to keep homeless out, so that was a clever way of putting a sign up, but it actually limited 50% of our parks could not be accessed because a person did not have a child. Now, I wanted to create a concession outside all these parks where you can rent a child if you're an adult, just so you can go in. We didn't do that. What I did was I changed every single sign, and now we increased access to our parks by 50%. Rules. Some people say, oh, New York City has a lot of money. I says, it doesn't take money to change a rule. That was limiting access. It wasn't being inclusive. And so that's one example, not just physical, but the rules we set could make people feel uncomfortable. And the homeless, by the way, I know it's controversial, but under my definition, they come under all. If a homeless person cannot go into a public park that's free and for all, where can they go? And a little bit on, I'll tell you another story about a homeless situation that really moved my heart, that changed my whole attitude and disposition about who do we allow in our park? Is it truly for all? Or if you don't have a home, you're not allowed into a free public park, which is available to everyone.
Yeah, we have lots of rules in Singapore, but we don't have that one. So the public parks are, we want to make sure that they are truly public. So we have rules on making sure that your cricket ball doesn't fly into somebody's face, or that you don't stake out a football field that somebody else might like to use for a picnic. But we then have to make sure we provide some other spaces for you to have your football and your cricket. So our parks are, I would say, I mean, to Commissioner Silva's point, we have quite a few rules for our parks, but I hope that those are rules that serve the purpose of inclusion and access, and increasing the common space, which is a sort of philosophical and ideological position that we take, that our regulatory approach must be to increase a common space, and the shared experience of that common space. Sometimes that requires the loosening of rules. Sometimes it requires the imposition of rules to keep the peace.
Now, taking a little bit of a different tack, one of the recent pushes in terms of city governance has been a focus on smart cities. But one of the criticisms of incorporating more technology into city operations is the possibility of privacy concerns around data collection and surveillance, such as the smart city initiatives at Sidewalk Labs Toronto. How, if at all, can cities mitigate concerns around such technology and ensure it is used in an equitable fashion? And I'd like to direct this question specifically to Dr. Puthucherry.
Indeed, the collection of data is going to be central to much of our efforts around smart cities and that process of using technology for social transformation. I would say that we can't get away from that difficult conversation and that difficult trade-off of privacy, security, and the usability of that process. There's no easy answer, and we benefit in Singapore from a relatively high trust in the institutional process, but we're one data breach away from losing that trust. And so the transparency around our processes of collection, of consent, our processes of dealing with errors when they happen, breaches when they happen, including, if necessary, prosecution and charges, and making sure that is visible to the public, is an important part of shoring up that trust. We do take a significant amount of ownership and responsibility for the government to do a significant part of that. Our view being that there is a role for the public sector in terms of the utilization of data, but that is a transaction between you and your customer. Whereas on a national basis, on a social basis, the state has to play a role. And part of that role is to then make sure there's an adequate protection of the process and the privacy. It's an ongoing conversation. And part of the uncertainty is that we really don't know what data is sensitive. I'm not sure, I don't want to pass judgment on your age, Abe, but in Singapore, people of what I assume to be your age don't recall a time when you had a yellow pages and you could look up the address and phone number of someone. But I do, and today you cannot. Simply scroll through a book or do a search and look up someone's phone number, and because in aggregate that data has now become quite sensitive, and the same is likely to be true of different pieces of data going forward, and it may even occur in the other direction, where for example, the information on my Facebook profile is public, and I would be hard pressed to make a case that what information that I have placed on the public profile will be considered sensitive, because I've made it easily available to the public. And so you may have a dynamic issue over time about what needs to be well protected and what needs to be liberalized, as well as what can be effectively utilized for the benefit of society. One example is transport data. I mean, we make quite a lot of our transport data easily available to the public, including, the location and arrival of buses, so that people can build apps and build services on top of that, and we release the data in good faith. We allow a certain amount of utilization by civil society and the private sector, but we must have the ability to pull back and to hold back if it becomes clear that through the application of technology, we have now introduced a privacy risk. Now, if we have processes for that release and management which are not under our direct control, we would not be able to easily then hold back and recalibrate once a new privacy risk is established. And for that reason, we take the view that the state has a very important role to play in that process.
I'm always struck by this question. I can't say an expert in technology, but I can say that in New York City, we explored counting people in parks by the amount of cell phone usage. And we knew up front that there would be no issue with privacy. But personally, I was on Facebook. I saw a documentary about how they actually are, how much privacy I'm giving up to Facebook and Google and everything else. And so I've learned how to go in and adjust some settings. But it's interesting right now how the private sector can gather this data, and people either willingly or unwillingly, not knowing, is giving up a lot of information about the location, about their habits, about what they're clicking. So it's already out there. I think the minute it starts engaging the public sector, these questions of privacy start to surface. I always wonder why smart city technology did not pick up in the States as it does overseas. That's something I'm still curious about, because I do believe in the future, data will help us make better decisions. But I also believe at the same time, we do have to guard the privacy. But right now we have a lot of these private companies, these giant tech companies that have a lot of data on each and every one of us, our behaviors, and they spit it back to us in terms of ads on Twitter and on Instagram. I've now gotten off of Facebook about 2 years after watching that one. I do click all the settings to make sure that my behavior and my location is not being tracked. But other than that, I don't have much more to add. But I do believe there's some benefits to smart cities, but at the same time, we have to protect our privacy, not from just the public sector, but also the private sector as well.
I think that one of the greatest challenges that the implementation of the concept of smart cities have had in many instances is the fact that it has been corporate driven. It has been a top-down design and even imposition on the part of very few large global corporations that sell their products and benefit from the implementation of smart cities to particular municipalities or regions. And in that sense, it hasn't been a people-driven approach to the matter. And the design of these technologies need to be people-driven. It needs to serve problems or challenges that the people, the groups of communities are facing, as opposed to technologies in search of a problem and sometimes creating a problem that doesn't exist in the first place. We have seen that too often happen, and that promotes a lot of lack of inclusion. And usually many of these smart city initiatives also are very driven by the economy and the efficiency of such projects. And I would argue that we need to look at other E's as well, again. And in this case, I would suggest the E for equity, the E for education, the E for engagement. If you don't have people buy in and educating on how is it that they can benefit and their communities can benefit from these so-called smart cities technologies, then what's the point of it all? And lastly, I have seen also that in many cities, the implementation of these projects are happening in manners that widen the inequality gaps already in existence, meaning that some of the projects are implemented in the wealthiest and widest part of the cities, leaving alone and aside communities of color and low-income communities in the process.
Abe, if I may just add on, Dr. Razabal and Commissioner Silva's comments just made me think of some additional points that I think are relevant to our experience in this space. Where we implement digital government services and where we implement smart cities technologies as a state intervention, one of the principles that we need to hold on to and that we use in our approach, because we don't have a private sector market-driven opportunity for that type of cost discipline and choice discipline that Dr. Irrazabal mentioned, we have to then impose that process ourselves as a state. And one of the ways we do that is to make sure that any process or transaction, if you're renewing a license or checking into a venue or a park, there must be a non-digital, non-smart version of it, and that even the smart version may have multiple platforms and multiple products, allowing then that process that Dr. Razabel talked about, where the citizen themselves, through a process of engagement and hopefully enjoyment, chooses which is the modality or the channel that they find most appropriate for them. And then over time, you see a shift from the paper-based to the phone-based or the web-based. And that internal market forces, as it were, sends us a very important signal as to what people value and what people understand. And it shores up public trust, because they are the ones making the choice about that move towards a digital platform. So that's an internal discipline that we have to impose on ourselves, that whatever process we put out there, there must be a non-tech version, a non-digital version. There must be some choice for the citizen about how to engage in that transaction, because then they themselves are empowered about the value of this smart technology. And that's been useful in our journey to then reinforce the idea of citizen engagement and citizen empowerment. And I think that's a useful discipline to hold on to. Thanks.
For the sake of time, this will be my final question before we go into audience Q&A. But this is a question centered around public health and relevant to cities today. But many of the epicenters for the COVID-19 pandemic have been highly dense urban regions, including initially in 2020, New York City, as well as now in cities throughout India, such as Delhi. What policies, if any, can be implemented to improve public health in the development of already concentrated cities? And we can start with directing this question to Dr. Irrazabal. Dr. Irrazabal, I believe you're muted.
I think that the representatives here in the panel of Singapore and New York have already partially responded to this question, suggesting, for example, the very important role of public space in cities, not only parks, but also the streets and the sidewalks themselves, and how we see that this outdoor public space allows for a lot healthier cities and healthier citizens. We know that there is a lot less contagion that happens in the outdoors, and now we are actually having provisions of not necessarily having to use masks while we are outdoors if we're vaccinated, etc. So we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel of the pandemic, and in great part this is coming about in dense urban areas because of the provision and use of public spaces and parks. So that's number one. But a very important other aspect of it is how we make certain that we do better with affordable, decent housing for the people, so that we reduce or eliminate altogether the problem of overcrowding that exists in some of our dense cities. We know that sometimes we have more than one family or multiple people that are unrelated living in the same household in manners that make it prohibitive for them to, say, quarantine themselves if they become subjected to COVID or something like that, and therefore exposed to the rest of the household members to contagion too. So how do we do better in the private realm of housing provision, and how we take greater advantage and continue expanding our public spaces, I think are key.
I know I answered earlier, and I wanted to just reemphasize what I said at the beginning. Clearly, the pandemic brought on severe stress and trauma, but also the whole civil and social unrest also was generational trauma. Poverty also adds trauma, and how certain communities dealt with all those traumas. I mean, clearly stress, our bodies like stress. So if we have to do a paper, the adrenaline starts flowing, but long-term stress equals trauma. And there are many communities dealing with generational trauma. So in 2020, when we had all these forces intersected, they really affected Black and Brown communities in an inequitable way. So what we did, as I said earlier, is that we recognized very quickly that our parks are not just for physical health, but also for mental health. And we repositioned our park system to be part of the healthcare system, where these are places people go for joy, where they go for healing, where they go for fresh air. Studies are telling you that just being in the park for 10 minutes reduces stress and reduces anxiety. But not everyone has access to these public spaces. New York is a dense city. They may have playgrounds and they may have some trees, but they may not have access to the larger, more passive parks, a lot greener. So we noticed during COVID, in those communities hardest hit, we had to close some of the basketball courts and playgrounds because people could not socially distance. And as Dr. Rasbell said, we opened up the streets because we wanted to give people those open spaces where they can breathe and feel alive. I'll never forget when the pandemic hit and we saw a hospital being created in Central Park. It was an unbelievable sight to see these white tents emerging in this green oasis. But at the same time, I saw people coming into the park just to escape the lockdown and the pause, and you saw the anxiety just drip off of them as they walked into this green space. These parks have become sanctuaries of sanity. We have to increase it more. We have to increase our tree canopy, because if we're going to open up our streets, we want to make sure it has trees as well. So I do agree that parks play a major role in our healthcare system to make sure these underserved communities, these communities that were hardest hit by COVID, has some of that relief where they can express joy, but they can also heal.
Thanks. I agree with the comments from both Dr. Rasbell and Commissioner Silver. If I just may add a slightly different view or on a different facet of this, in the pandemic, the public health response demonstrated the value to us in Singapore of two additional factors. I mean, I completely agree about the importance of the approach to the outdoor spaces, but two additional factors. One is that from a both planning and regulatory perspective, we're effectively one healthcare system. You need to be able to mobilize and manage the health resources and the health assets and the response across the city as one. And that took some doing. It took some time to get all the pieces integrated, the private sector, the public sector, the different aspects of the private sector, the different aspects of the public sector. So that doesn't happen naturally. It doesn't happen easily. But once it can be done, it allows a certain type of public health response, which potentially is very useful in this type of crisis. The second point I wanted to make is referencing our earlier conversation that early in the pandemic, the value of data was demonstrated. Even public transport indicators giving us forewarning of people's changing behaviors and the extent to which people are likely to comply or to shift their behavior as a result of anxieties was very useful in having that dynamic nature of issuing instructions, regulations, edicts sometimes that were necessary as part of that crisis, so that the pre-positioning of data, as it were, and the live view of data allowed an iterative, dynamic response to a public health crisis. And not all the data that was used was purely public health. It was data of all types that was essential. And then in the response, where we talked about movement controls and access logging, all of that was on the substrate of a data architecture and a data infrastructure. So we had a national check-in process for venues. We had a proximity a token and a mobile phone app measuring proximity to other people through Bluetooth, and all of this required a data architecture and a data infrastructure that was very useful early on in the pandemic. So we need it all. We need it all. You know, we need that cultural and social response. We need that infrastructure, access to spaces and public spaces. We need the tech as well to try to bring us through crises of this nature. Thanks.
Well, thank you all so much for answering all of my questions. Now we will be moving into the audience Q&A. And as a note to the audience, if you still have any questions for our three amazing panelists, please feel free to submit it to the form and we can add it to our list. So to start off, with COVID-19, a lot of employers started to allow working from home. With that, many people started moving out of cities to relocate to more suburban areas that have cheaper costs of living. How will this affect the development of current metropolitan areas, versus that of suburban communities? And we can start by directing this question to Commissioner Silver.
Well, yes, I've heard that trend. And when you live long enough, you know that there are cycles. We do know people responding right now. They're being impulsive. They believe it's safe. I lived in cities and I've lived in suburbs. And I suspect after a while, people start to crave and miss the dynamics and the energy of cities that you cannot get in the suburbs. So I do think this is a trend we need to watch. It's happening to many, many people. But I certainly agree that as time goes on, people start to make those lifestyle choices and either move closer back to the city or move in the city. So I believe this is something that's temporary because all the trends are showing that this is the century of cities. People love the energy of cities. They love the livability of cities. And while the suburbs give them temporary relief, I think once the pandemic subsides and people feel a lot more comfortable, you'll start seeing a reverse trend of people coming back to the cities because they're such exciting places to be. So that's my personal opinion.
Yes, I tend to agree that these things come in cycles. And I read a recent article in the New York Times a couple of days ago that was saying, yes, the suburbs are gaining more population and the city is also coming back. So both things are true already. So, and this will happen into the future as well. In terms of migrations, though, I'm more concerned about the climate refugees that we're starting to see coming to the country from other countries to start with. For example, climate change has decimated small economies in Central American countries, and that's the type of migration that we are now seeing at the US-Mexico border here, but also internal migration from the southern states of the country into the central and northern states of the country, and even from the coast, east and west coast, to central and other areas of the country, trying to move away from climate change effects, including that of the rise of the sea levels, but also flooding and droughts and hurricanes, etc.
I just have one point to make. Firstly, many of the points don't apply to Singapore. We are one big suburb and one big city all rolled into one. There isn't a lot of places to go. But I would say in the course of human history, one of the greatest forces for transformation has been the pressure for rural to urban migration. And that process is still playing out across much of the world, certainly in our region, in Southeast Asia and Asia. You can see there's an ongoing flow for that rural to urban migration. Certainly, I think in the short term, there may have been disruptions to that process as a result of the pandemic, but I think the forces, the economic and social pressures that drive that, I think will just reassert themselves, and you'll have that equilibrium between the city centers and the suburbs reestablished that the other two panelists had talked about. I do agree.
Our next audience question comes from Tara. There are a number of cities in the world that have adopted sustainable development initiatives in their city infrastructure and building construction. Is there a specific city model or approach towards sustainable development that you believe that cities can and should model after? And we can direct this question initially to Dr. Puthucherry.
I think each city is in a fairly unique circumstance, both their geography, their climate, but much more importantly, that mix of economy and social cultural phenomena that have created a city. I mean, the cities are the phenomena of the century. So I think to say that there is a particular model that is the template we should all follow is probably not giving enough attention to the unique characteristics of each individual city in the process of transformation. Nobody starts from a zero base. You start from an existing economic, cultural base that you have to transform. And I think you have to take that into account. Having said that, there are plenty of models from around the world, and that's certainly the approach that we would like to take, is to learn from the best and then try to adapt it to our circumstances. And the constraints, I mean, the constraints that Singapore faces are not the constraints that many cities face. And there's no reason then for other cities to take exactly the same approach as we do. I mean, we have a constraint on landfill. I mean, we're literally running out of space that we can use as landfill. And that's not something that cities with a large rural hinterland will face as a constraint. And so their planning processes might be completely different. But there are, as I say, plenty of good models out there, and we look to learn from the best.
Yeah. I'm going to highlight too, because in the US, a lot of the building codes are really governed by the construction industry and the building industry. And they make sure that the rules work in their favor. Unless those industries want to change, there will not be any change. However, we have seen a lot of change over the last couple of decades with LEED certification. Now it's becoming a standard, whether it's platinum, gold, or silver. You're finding more and more companies are taking pride on pursuing those materials and systems that will get them to that LEED certification. And it's the same with sites. Landscape architects have something called sustainable sites, similar to LEED, but it's for sites. And so those are some examples that we're seeing movement happening in the private sector that now want to pursue those certifications. And you'll see that seal right there, usually in the lobby. So it's hard to say if there's a country that's doing it, but here in the US, I know it best. Very difficult to change building code, but I have to give the Green Council a lot of credit. Years ago, it was kind of talked about, and now almost every building is stating how they want to proceed, either platinum, gold, or silver LEED certification.
I also agree with the idea that climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resilience need to be context sensitive. It needs to respond to the particularities and resources and opportunities that occur in every and each city. But at the same time, we have tons that we can learn from what people are doing and cities are doing all around the world. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to be savvy and studious about learning from what others are doing and what has worked and to what extent, and whether it makes sense to adapt it and how to the conditions that we face in our own cities. And we also need to learn from history, because not only are things happening now as we speak that we need to learn from, but also we have lived differently in our cities in history. So why don't we go back also and rescue some of these traditions and customs that we have as societies ourselves and other societies around the world, where when we lived simpler in the world, when we consumed less and when we produced less waste and all of that. And in that sense, in that very same vein, learn also from our indigenous communities that are teaching ways of living more in sync with the biocapacities of the ecosystems that they inhabit.
Thank you so much. And we have time for one last audience question. And so this is an anonymous question. What are the things residents should know about the workings of a city? What are the things residents should know about the workings of a city? And we can direct this question initially to Dr. Razabel. And I would just ask that, since it's our final question, if you could all keep the answers a little bit shorter.
Well, I invite this person to consider our planning programs. You have a wonderful one at Berkeley. I'm directing one here in the University of Maryland, College Park, and we can devote 2 full years to study this, right? Because cities are very complex organism, and they have many sectors to it, and you can become a generalist, learning a little bit about everything and try to orchestrate conversations and teams around organizing all these different aspects of city functioning, or you can become a specialist and select to delve into transportation or into housing or into urban design or into economic and community development. There are many sectors and they need to be ingrained and create something together that hopefully is more than the sum of the parts.
And I would just add that infrastructure and what happens underground, there's an anatomy and a soul of a city of how it works. The anatomy is the infrastructure. I think the best thing I would tell the students is just get SimCity, play with it, and you understand how complex cities become. That's the anatomy. But then in terms of the soul, every city is different. New York is not Singapore. Singapore is not San Francisco. It's the personality that is just inherent to that location. Every American city is not the same. Every European city is not the same. So I encourage you, get some city, but understand when you look at cities, there's an anatomy and then there's a soul. And once you understand both, if you're going to engage in cities, then I believe that you'll be fascinated and you chose the right profession to be engaged in places and cities.
If you're interested in how a city works, you have to walk it to understand a component that perhaps you wouldn't get from any other experience. Second point I'd make is that whatever your point of view about your city, somebody else in the city has exactly the opposite point of view, which makes the life of planners and politicians very difficult. And thirdly, despite that, our cities get better every day, and they are fabulous, wonderful places to live, creating opportunities for everybody, and they can be inclusive, uplifting, and empowering, and that's what we have to aim for.
Well, thank you all so much for answering all of these questions and coming to the forum today. I would now like to invite our president, Aparna Iyer, back up to the virtual stage for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Abhay, and thank you all so much for such an incredible conversation. A huge virtual round of applause to all of our speakers for the evening and to Abhay, our moderator. We really appreciate you being here tonight. And in fact, as a token of our appreciation, at every single Berkeley Forum event, our communications team designs a custom poster for the speakers, and this event is no exception. So this was designed for you all tonight by Monet from our communications team. And at this point, I just invite you to make any last closing remarks that you want to make to the audience before we close out.
I'll defer to ladies first.
Thank you very much again for the invite and for having this forum to discuss the future of cities. Again, I think that you are the generation that we were waiting for, and we have our hopes in you. So continue to be very outward focused, thought-provoking, hope radiating, and ambitious in the manner that you have conveyed today. Thank you.
My final comment is I believe that planners or people that engage in places, you're really guardians of the future. You're looking to the future to make sure I got your back. And so I just encourage you to embrace that notion, because if we're not guardians of the future in our profession, my question is, who is? And so that has been really my purpose throughout my career, and it served me well. And I hope I can impart that wisdom to you to embrace it as well. Please be guardians of your future. Your country needs you. Your planet needs you.
Thank you very much to the students and the members of the forum, and also to my fellow panelists from whom I have learned a lot this evening for you, this morning for me. It's been great answering your questions, and I think I'm very heartened by the direction that your questions have taken. I think the future of cities is looking good if there are people such as yourselves involved in the planning and development of these centers of growth, excellence, development, and opportunity for all our people. Thank you.
Thank you all for those remarks. And now, quickly to our audience, I'd like to take a moment to recognize everyone who worked so hard to put this event together. I think it was a great panel to sort of close out the semester and the year, and an important topic to discuss. So thanks to everyone who participated and helped out in the planning of this panel. And lastly, to our audience, thank you so much for such a wonderful semester. It's been an honor to serve as president and to see the work that's gone into putting on this lineup for all of you. I really appreciate the attendance that we've had throughout. The goal of the forum is sort of just to spread discourse within the community. And so we really appreciate all the engagement that we've had from all of you. So we encourage you to check back in with us. Feel free to fill out the feedback form with any speaker suggestions or advice you have for us at tinyurl.com/forumfeedbackspring21, and to check us out on our website at forum.berkeley.edu. If you are willing and able, you can feel free to help support us at our Venmo, the QR code for which is located on the screen. And lastly, I just want to thank you all so much for such a lovely year. Thank you for spending your evening at the Berkeley Forum, and we hope to see you at another event next semester. Thank you.